Hello, this is my presentation on sports operations and legal aspects. In this presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about the UK parliamentary system, the UK law, sports law, and more specifically competition law and how that relates to football, specifically in the Premier League and in England. So, to give a bit of context, in recent years, UK society has become sceptical and started to wonder whether if the current voting system in the country is the right way to go about electing a government and a leader. And this is due to the influence of right and left policies, and some have argued that it's provided a service to sport in different contexts. So, for instance, left-wing policies have influenced public sport. Many could see it in a positive way, and some would argue that right-wing policies have actually benefited private and elite sport. In addition to this, sports law being a relatively new phenomenon, it's impacted the world of sport in many ways, and therefore exploration on some of the issues of the current governing systems in sport will be beneficial. For instance, the Court of Arbitration of Sport and FIFA and UEFA. With the intense commercialisation of football being prominent in the last 20 years or so, it's to no surprise that the sport is now facing several issues. Many laws are now being used as strategic weapons to combat regulations set by federations such as FIFA and UEFA, and this was a view of Vogel and Vogel. So this is a brief breakdown of the UK parliamentary system. We've got the monarch that obviously expresses the approval of legislation with the Prime Minister and the government. And the government, being the cabinet of senior ministers, advise the Prime Minister and essentially administer the country. So they administer the departments and finances, etc. Dunleavy actually raised issues amongst recent hung parliaments, which have arguably caused disruption and disagreement amongst Conservatives. So the problem with this is that the actual voting system has led to problems, meaning that legislation has took longer to be passed or to be lobbied against, and this has been seen as an issue. We then have the breakdown of the two houses of Parliament. So you've got the House of Commons, which is made up of 650 MPs, and then the House of Lords, which is occupied by senior and experienced, maybe previous MPs and people who have been involved in politics. The House of Lords shares responsibility for making laws with the House of Commons. It plays a vital role in law development, and they tend to spend more time scrutinising legislation than the House of Commons. The UK Parliament said that the House of Lords has important lawmaking and scrutiny functions, but its powers are limited by a combination of law and convention. So one thing that I would probably point out is that there should maybe be more emphasis on the House of Lords actually pushing legislation, because these people have had vast experience in UK politics and have a better understanding perhaps than some of the MPs within government. The House of Commons is made up again of members of Parliament who articulate the views of the British people within their constituencies, heavily involved in the legislative process, and they scrutinise and lobby against government policies and expenditure. So they tend to look at what the government's spending, and they tend to lobby and argue either against or for that. Hilton suggested that voters today are searching for new options beyond the two-party model. Many support these arguments, claiming that the system provides a disservice to democracy. Elections consistently dominated by two political parties and their rigid policies that only suit far left or far right approach. So, again, as mentioned, these policies will either influence sport in a positive or negative way, and will either influence public or private elite sport. So UK law tends to be broken down into three different types of law. So we have statutory law, which is written legislation that's passed through parliamentary system, government, and then authorised by the monarch. This is also known as an Act of Parliament. You then have common laws, which is usually set by examining the outcomes of previous cases that are similar or alike, and they use them as a point of guidance to come to an outcome or conclusion. And this is also known as case law. And then finally, we have European Union laws, which are a set of laws that are abided by all the member states within the European Union. And this tends to overwrite national law, so statutory law, as a result of the European Communities Act, which was passed in 1972. So sports law generally falls into private law. There's public and private law. Tends to fall into that, as most cases are between the individual and a private organisation. So, for instance, an athlete and UEFA, or athlete and FIFA, or an athlete and Premier League, perhaps. Nonetheless, some cases can occupy public law, and as we know, sport is vastly integrated into society nowadays. So, often the public, being a sports consumer, could come into contact with it. Particularly commercially, and this is when public law may be enforced in some cases. Laws are exercised by the state. They actually tend to often fail to come into sports law environment because the sports governing bodies and federations do not employ them. Therefore, each investigation is dealt case by case, known to be common law. So, actually, the governing bodies and federations do have it in their They tend to express that they'll trying to meet the standards of statutory laws, but they don't actually have to comply with them. And these cases are referred to the largest federations of sport. So, using football as a context, the obvious examples being FIFA, UEFA, and the Court of Arbitration of Sport. Foster 2005 critically evaluated the sports law model used by CAS and concluded that the dangers of such systems was that the sporting power and assertion of laws remains wholly in the federation's hands. So, this has welcomed tyrannical sort of forthcomings in the recent years, with senior representatives of the organisations exercising their own power to benefit particular parties, and the most obvious example being Sepp Blatter. On the other hand, Erbsen highlighted some factors that certainly endorse the need for such entities, so having actual definitive rights and obligations for athletes, and there actually are bodies that deal with that, so FIFPro and ECA, they tend to do that, and also saving costs and immense litigation. So there's a very heavy process that comes in these cases that are brought to the attention of these of the courts. And therefore some would argue that it actually reduces the costs and the time constraints of them. Now, despite the relief that CAS can offer in terms of the quicker processes and the cost limitation, the phenomenon that is sports law, otherwise known as Lex Sportiva or Lex Ludica, which translates to law of sport or the law judge, it's relatively new, and the use of Latin words itself being somewhat playful. And some may argue that it questions its legitimacy. More to the point, though, being that each scenario is assessed case by case, formulating common law. Therefore, the system needs to experience many cases so that they can come to an outcome for future scenarios by using the guidance of all cases. The questions that could be raised from that are: what happens if the scenario that's brought to existence hasn't yet been lobbied at the governing bodies or CAS? And how is a fair conclusion reached? There's still a lot of ambiguity and open ends. So, as mentioned, the legislation that we're going to look at is actually a piece of European competition law legislation. This is Article 101. It was implemented by the TFEU in 2003. The UK have their own competition act that was implemented in 1998, which simply states that the UK competition rules should be applied in line with those of the European Union, so they will follow this legislation. The Act was introduced to prohibit companies and big businesses from restricting trade and competition between business entities, essentially. The 5 key points that need to be complied with are as follows. So, the directly or indirectly fixed purchase or selling prices or any other trading conditions. Limit or control production, markets, technical development or investment. share markets or sources of supply, apply dissimilar conditions to equivalent transactions with other trading parties, thereby placing them at a competitive disadvantage, make the conclusion of contracts subject to acceptance by the other parties of supplementary obligations which by their nature or according to commercial usage have no connection with the subject of such contracts. So they're the 5 key points that fall into that legislation, and we're going to look at a couple of case studies that tried to argue that this legislation wasn't being upheld by sport, football in particular, by the Premier League and UEFA in particular. So the Striana case against football and financial fair play rules came into place a couple of years ago now. Daniel Striani is actually a football agent who argued a case against football financial fair play sanctions. So he suggested that the regulations were actually causing an anti-competitive environment within football, and this was essentially failing to comply with TFEU competition law. It's particularly interesting in this case, and it's relevant to sports competition law, to the sports discussion law, because it takes into consideration a lot of problems currently developing throughout world football, and these being FFP and the effects it has on its clubs and its players. But it also brings into the context of how it's affecting the public and the consumers. So Flanagan and Duval actually brought down the complaints of Daniel Striana's case quite well. They articulated the 5 points that were key in his argument. So he suggested that it actually restricted the external investment into football. It will have the effect of calcifying the hierarchy of the game, preventing small clubs from competing at higher levels. It actually depressed the transfer market, it depressed players' wages, and it will therefore adversely affect players' agents' revenue. Now, they are all very relevant points and probably, many would argue, quite logical. The only one that I'd probably argue against is the 5th point, and it's no common it's no factor that actually an agent is trying to argue this case to benefit himself, and that was actually one of the counter arguments that the courts had against him, was that he wasn't arguing the case on behalf of the public or the private businesses in terms of sports clubs. He was actually arguing the case to benefit for himself. So by financial fair play affecting the transfer market, players' wages, and the investment that was going into football, it was actually affecting business and money that he was going to be gaining from his players and player fees and such. So there's actually further cases involving European Union competition law and football were discussed actually in the Philho paper. It was a very good paper. It breaks down a table that shows clearly many disputes that have been had. 2 key ones being the European Commission argument against World Cup in 1999, which was about ticketing arrangements, and the European Commission against UEFA in 2003, and that was to do with football media rights. So what are the contemporary issues that come from competition law and this competition law debate? There's a breakdown here that sort of shows how it affects or it could potentially affect things in the future. As a result of commercialisation within football, FFP sanctions mean that clubs are affected by the following. So the internal issues with FFP being club sponsorship deals, the timing of sanctions imposed on non-compliant clubs by the UEFA and other governing bodies within sport, and the size or amount of sanctions on non-compliant clubs. So them two being the key ones that we're going to talk about. You know, when do they apply the sanctions on clubs that are non-compliant? What effect it's going to have on the smaller clubs or the compliant clubs? And what are the size or amount of sanctions that are exposed onto these clubs? The second one being broadcasting rights. So the debate is actually a huge discussion. It has been for recent years. The lack of options for free TV users now because of BT and Sky TV essentially owning the rights to view football games in all capacities: Premier League, Champions League, and the other UEFA competitions. So we'll talk a little bit about them in the next coming slides. So financial fair play. Well, a lot of people actually think that it only associates to UEFA competitions, where actually it applies to all clubs outside of UEFA competitions. So the Premier League and the Football League have their own sanctions in place, or at least some. But they tend to fluctuate. The acceptable losses amount that clubs are allowed to have each season is different in different competitions. So, for instance, the Premier League, you can actually have acceptable losses of 105 million over 3 years. The Football League is actually an £8 million loss, and in UEFA competitions, it's a £45 million loss over 2 years. So, they do fluctuate, and it's still unsure as well what are some of the sanctions. The Premier League, in particular, and the UEFA. Actually impose on these clubs that are not complying with these regulations, and that's one of the arguments that have come recently. So yeah, clubs can still make acceptable losses, and this doesn't mean club revenues have to break even with overall costs. And we've seen this in recent years where the larger clubs are spending mass amount of money on players and wage fees, and some people have argued that it's actually providing a disservice against smaller sides and smaller clubs. In particular, while the arguments being that when are the sanctions actually going to be imposed on a club? So what we're finding is that clubs are submitting their financial reports later Feb and March time, and tends to be when we fall into the latter stages of the UEFA competitions, and then by that point a sanction, it's whether can you impose it there and then in terms of point deduction, expulsion from competition, or do you do that the following season? Now, if you were to impose them sanctions in the following season, the argument might be from compliant clubs, well, we're playing against a non-compliant club with better resources, better players, and actually this isn't fair. So that's one of the arguments that could come from the financial fair play debate. The second one being what actually are the sanctions. So the Premier League don't actually have a defined set of sanctions on clubs, and we're seeing this with the larger teams spending more money than the smaller clubs and having greater losses, and still being able to compete with no penalties whatsoever. So there needs to be a definition on what exactly the sanctions are, and in UEFA competitions we've seen it in recent years as well, in a couple of case example studies, one being this case example 2. So Tribune actually expressed this quite well. UEFA's FFP regulations state clubs that have qualified for its competitions have to prove they do not have overdue payables towards other clubs, their players and social or tax authorities throughout the season. And this was actually to do with a couple of the smaller clubs involved in the UEFA Europa competition, and they were sanctioned and penalised, a financial penalty. However, the penalties were different for each club, and some people would say, well, we've been fined X amount and they've only been fined X amount. How is that fair? And many would argue that the small clubs are at a disadvantage to the larger clubs because the smaller clubs will not generate as much revenue as the larger ones, but they may have that investment from their owners or sponsorship deals that bring them a lot of investment, and they want to spend that money on players, but because they're actually not producing the same amount of revenue in terms of, so it comes against as a loss, they're actually being fined against that. The second case example, which is labelled case example 1, was by Harris. So he discussed in greater detail some of the problems surrounding the Premier League and the Football League, and the best example really being QPR. When they were promoted, they actually failed to comply with the Football League's acceptable losses regulations. They spent a lot of money on players and player wages to get promoted to the Premier League, but the argument was then, well, the club isn't actually a part of the Football League now. It's now a Premier League club, and therefore were they right to be able to penalise a club that didn't fall into their leagues? So this is another problem and another debate which is being had and could be had in the years to come. So looking at broadcasting rights now, there was two papers that I looked at that discussed this topic. One being Buck and Terrazono in 2005. So they said to ensure compliance with European Union competition legislation, the Premier League has accepted the Commission's calls for an end to its exclusive distribution of live broadcast rights, bringing an end to Sky B's 15-year monopoly of its main subscription driver. And this was really to do with increasing the competition for broadcasting right bids, and this was probably as a result of European competition law, because what it was actually doing was suppressing that, and there wasn't enough competition within the market. So this actually was very, very relevant, and a very relevant movement as a result of legislation such as this. The second one from James and Gay, who's done extensive amount of research on competition law. They said, one concern that may be well expressed, especially by Sky, is that the exclusion from the complete auction process of any one broadcaster may be anti-competitive in itself. So it actually reverts the other way as well, and Sky may argue that that they're actually being enforced by legislation to do things that the legislation is actually arguing against. So again, this was another argument. It was a counter argument to what was actually being said by this legislation. Now, with these developments and implications pushed by the European Commission itself, it's made it increasingly difficult for broadcasting rights holders, and some European competition law has been a disservice to them. However, as a result of this, it's actually harmed the competition of the two largest rivals in BT and Sky Sports, and then this has actually harmed the value of these Premier League broadcasting rights that they're auctioning off. So in recent years, BT and Sky Sports have actually bidded smaller amounts of money to take the broadcasting rights for the competition, and this is then welcome competition from Amazon, who we know will now showcase 20 matches a season between 2019 and 2022, and it could likely be welcomed more by other streaming services, particularly online. That movement that's happening right now, for instance, Netflix, etc. And the two largest competitors in Sky and BT have actually started to find alternatives which are benefiting both parties. So, as Ahmed and Falds transcribed the quote at the bottom of this slide, another incentive for the two to bid strongly against one another fell away in December when they signed a cross-licensing deal, allowing BT to include Sky Sports in its television packages from 2019 and Sky to sell BT Sport to its subscribers. So this shows what this legislation is doing in terms of how the market is competing for these rights. What they're deciding to do is, well, we'll bid less and we'll advertise, we'll sell the rights and broadcasting the football games actually across platforms. So they're actually receiving the rights for cheaper prices, but then also gaining an access to the two audiences between the platforms. So how does it move forward? How does the legislation move forward, and how can it be better implemented? Well, the UEFA and FIFA need to actually produce clear penalties that exactly define what they're going to do to non-compliant clubs that aren't complying to the legislation and the regulations of FFP particularly, and they have to remain consistent every season. Otherwise, they may have clubs that will bring cases to court that are actually saying, well, you're benefiting the larger clubs, and as a smaller club, we want to receive the investment. We have the investment there from external sources, but we can't actually use that to buy new players and spend it on wages, because we know that the revenue we make throughout the season will not counteract it, and will not break even. We'll have a larger loss and will then be penalised. So that's one of the arguments that may come of it, and they need to recognise that. Secondly, the UK government must review its own competition law because of Brexit and what the coming's going to be of that. They won't have to comply with European law anymore with not being a member state of the European Union. So clubs might actually try to take advantage because the legislation that's in place or lack of legislation that's in place is allowing them to do so. So a review of the current existing European competition law would be beneficial. They can assess the flaws that are within that legislation and then apply their own. And then finally, the international and European courts should develop legislation which pushes federations such as FIFA and UEFA to always comply with the laws of each state, so that the power isn't entirely in their hands. International and European courts should remain sovereign to prevent tyranny and things that have escalated in recent years that have actually give the power to hire members of these organisations in many circumstances. So to conclude, the current voting model used in the UK is arguably benefiting just two-party systems. The parliamentary system needs to discuss and lobby a better way to elect the country's leadership, and we know that sport and has been influenced heavily by this. Secondly, sports law still remains open-ended and ambiguous for many cases. There needs to be clearer guidance for athletes and clubs, and there's a lot of athletes and clubs that aren't aware of some of these bodies. So, for instance, CAS, they aren't aware of this and they don't know where to go to be able to bring a case forward. Sports federations continue to assert power of laws without existing those by the state. So, again, there needs to be a there needs to be a better understanding of who's in charge, and I believe that it needs to be sovereign, that the European laws and state laws are essentially at the forefront. Finally, competition laws, we know, has surfaced many underlying issues within football in the last 20 years. The UEFA regulations and sanctions imposed on teams are still too varied and uncertain. It's expected many more cases will arise in the years to come as football continues to commercialise, and we'll start to see more developments. You could argue that the broadcasting rights actually has the legislation that's impacting broadcasting rights has actually benefited it because it's stretched the market a little bit, and we're starting to see new competition come in terms of Amazon that are bidding for these rights. But there actually needs to be more rights given to the public and people who can only access free TV, where they would maybe want to access a football game and watch a football game, they actually can't. Particularly the European competitions, which at the moment are just they're put onto platforms such as Sky and BT. Thank you for watching.